They told us we were chasing ghosts. We told them we were looking for footprints. We set cameras deep in Bigfoot territory, in a pocket of mountain the maps treated like blank paper, and what the footage caught was never meant to be seen. It was July of 1977, when Vince and I left the last town with 4 fuel cans, 2 cases of film, a bulk roll of 16mm, and a battered field notebook that had belonged to my grandfather, Thomas Reed. The notebook was thin with years and corners softened by hands that had loved maps more than comfort. Thomas's penciled entries, scraps of routes, dates, and the brittle sentences of a man who had seen too many things and told as little as possible, were the only proper invitation we had. In those margins he had scrawled measurements: 17 print, ridge pattern, wet season, shelter on lee side. He had also written, in a different ink, keep it from prying eyes. That last line felt less like a suggestion and more like an inheritance. We set up from habit and hunger, my youth's curiosity and Vince's habit of precision. Vince, a Vietnam vet with a camera strapped to his shoulder like a rifle, moved through the forest with a surgical economy. He had a way of carrying equipment that made even heavy things seem light. On the first clear morning, he adjusted a 400mm telephoto onto an aluminum tripod, checked a Nikon F that had seen better days but still earned our trust, and tucked an old Super 8 Bolex in its leather case. My kit was more makeshift: a spare Nikon, stacks of Kodak Tri-X, and a tape recorder that still smelled faintly of smoke from a past mountain camp. We packed dry food, water, wire, and the measure of stubbornness you need to camp under the same stars as something that doesn't want to be seen. Before we left, I remember Vince tilting his head toward the range and saying, "If they're here, they don't want to be famous." The way he said it was practical, not sentimental. He had seen men with guns and men with cameras, and he believed cameras got less sympathy than either. He was right. Cameras have a habit of making private things public. The first trail we followed was subtle, only visible if you were looking for the wrong things in the right way. At first we thought it was deer. Then the ground changed, the leaf litter compressed in a pattern, depressions deeper than a human stride, edges that suggested a broad, heavy weight. We marked the site, took photographs from a safe distance with a telephoto, and pressed film between stiff fingers, as if that could somehow make the moment less fragile. What surprised both of us was the skin pattern. The print wasn't merely large, it carried texture on its surface, dermal ridges running like old riverbeds across a palm. We measured with a rule from Thomas's notebook, 17 inches from heel to toe. The width was staggering. I remember setting the lens down and kneeling to put my hand in the center of that hollow to get scale. My fingers fit inside the grooves of the print like they were tracing a fingerprint. Vince, who could estimate weight with frightening accuracy from a glance at a track, said, 600 at least, maybe more. We left no long note. We set 3 cameras in increments around the main trail, one telescoped out on the ridge to watch the lee side, another tucked just low enough to see the entrance at the base of the rock, both mounted with long lenses and a hope that the film would survive, and a small motion camera hidden beneath moss that we fastened to a cedar limb. There were no modern triggers. We were working with coaxed timing and patience with black bags to keep light from leaking into the film cans. We left them like message jars, sealed, waiting for the sea to come, or a creature to enter an unlit stage. If this story is catching you now, if the thought of old film and an old secret draws you, I ask that you stay with the whole account. There are frames that must be seen in context, and I can't in good conscience have them treated like a circus. You'll understand why soon enough. We made our descent on the 3rd day. The ridge had given us a sense of distance. The telephoto had convinced us at least of structures. 2 shapes, low and rounded, that sat against a rock face like nests. Up close, the place smelled of smoke and earth and something sweeter, like the scent of old cedar that had been kept from rain. Sunlight leaned into the clearing in long gold bars, and when we stepped carefully between the trunks, 2 figures stood as if they had expected us. They were taller than any man I had ever seen. Kura stood first, the elder by posture rather than by height. He had a face rimed with gray fur, eyes that were deep and slow as a pond. Beside him, smaller and skinnier, was Thray, hands stained with ochre, fingers tapered as if used to the delicate work of drawing. They wore no clothes in the sense we understand clothes. Instead, their bodies were draped in woven hides and plant fiber wraps. Each piece worked with an economy and sense of purpose that spoke of centuries of problem-solving. The first moments were a study in silence. Birds on the ridge fell quiet. Vince instinctively raised his camera, thumb ready on the shutter. I could feel the whir of the Super 8 in its case, the small mechanical heartbeat of the film we had brought to bear against the world. For a second I imagined the lenses would be the violence, the bright click, the silver tooth that bites at the quiet. But a different kind of exchange took shape. Kura cocked his head, a motion like a teacher listening to a child recite an unfamiliar poem. His palms were broad and marked, calluses and scars telling us of a life of steady labor. He extended one of those hands slowly, not toward us, but toward the tripod, toward the inanimate thing that had been placed in his space. It was a test as old as curiosity. Does this contraption bite? The tripod was foreign, the aluminum and screw threads as obvious as a rock. Kura's fingers traced the mount with an unexpected gentleness. He tapped at the lens, felt its weight, then pressed his forehead to it as if taking measure of the cold glass. We didn't move. We had rehearsed what restraint looked like in our heads, but restraint feels different when breath is thin and every nerve is lit. Vince whispered, "Don't photograph him." Not yet. It was more an order to himself than to me. There are things a photograph can do. Make a moment permanent, reduce a being to an image. There were also things a photograph could do wrong. Three's eyes found my hands. He crouched, not so much on one knee as in an understanding of balance, and, with a stick, began to scratch in the dirt. Simple strokes. At first I thought he was drawing shapes to show us. Then I realized he was making our prints in the earth. Our boots, the tripod legs, the lens itself. He drew the ridge line too, and the arc of the rock. The marks were composed with the patience of someone arranging pieces of a life on a board for inspection. He looked up, holding out the stick like an offering. We accepted that offering. It was the beginning of the only language we could trust then: gesture. We mimed small things: food, shelter, smoke. Kura understood the gesture for water and pointed toward a hollow where a slow stream pooled. He guided us, but at every point there was an assessment, a calibration. These were animals of observation, not of brute force. Inside the larger of the two shelters, the world shifted. There were shelves and racks made of woven branches, jars with preserved roots, bundles of dried meat and bone, tools worked in metal and stone. A knife lay in a leather wrap. It was a small folding blade stamped with a maker's mark I didn't know but could date. A European import from somewhere near the turn of the century. Someone had set it down with care. Stacked against the shelter wall were books and newspapers, their edges browned like old bread. The headline of one paper stared up at me. The date was 1945. A photograph showed men in a landscape nearly identical to the one outside our own shelter. There were margins scribbled in a hand I couldn't read. It is one thing to find evidence of tool use. It is another to find a curated history. The shelves told a story of people keeping and preserving things that mattered, of cataloging. Kura reached for one of the books and laid it on a flat stone like an altar. It opened to a plate of drawings, birds, a study of antlers inked with a naturalist's patient hand. Beside those plates on thinner paper were drawings in charcoal and ochre, figures with long limbs holding up things that looked like cages, and crude helicopters, and men in small boats. In a panel there was a sequence of small people being gathered and loaded into a pen. It was an archive not of curiosity but of memory, and memory in that place had the sharpness of a wound. We photographed what we could with restraint, but the cameras were not the same as being present. The telephoto on the ridge had given us distance. Being inside a shelter with the creatures, their eyes on us, their hands moving with practiced reverence, felt like entering a private room with the lights still on. The footage we took later would show small domestic things. Through sitting cross-legged as he drew, Kura grinding grains, a moment where Kura leaned in to touch my face with fingers that were warmer than I expected. That frame, a single grainy still of a hand on a cheek, would be the one people later called proof. It would not be proof in the way scientists demand proof. It would be proof as mercy. They showed us more than tools. On a low table they had arranged small carved figures, animals rendered with an economy of line and striking simplicity. 3 tapped one with a stick and then tapped my chest as if to say, "We make, you understand." He produced a stringed thing that vibrated with a single note when plucked, and the sound wrapped the shelter like a memory of wind. Kura hummed along, and what came out of them was not language we could parse, but it was deliberate. They had structure in their sounds. We found, tucked behind a bundle of hides, a compact metal box with a clasp that had been forced closed and then stitched with rawhide. Inside were newspaper clippings enclosed in oilcloth. The dates ranged back decades. One clipping was an article about a bounty offered during the 1930s. Another told of livestock losses blamed on wild beasts. There were photographs, black and white prints, blurred and worn, showing groups of men standing with rifles. One image in particular made my stomach drop, a photograph of a field with a machine in the sky, rotors spread, and figures on the ground. Someone had scrawled across the top of that print with a thick stroke, "Hunters." The handwriting matched the marginalia in the book. Seeing those images in that shelter felt like someone had opened a door and let in the winter air. The creatures around us moved, but there was no panic in their movements, only the slow gathering of attention. Kura took up one of the prints and looked at it with a tenderness that stunned me. His fingers traced the rotor blade as if feeling the memory of its motion. Then he pointed outward, to the east, and in the dirt he drew men in a line, helicopters in the sky. He tapped the print, tapped the drawing, and then met our faces as if to say, "You see this now. We remember." At that moment, the idea of disclosure shifted for me. It had once been a curiosity. To be the man who brought back images and notes, the one who could lay a black and white sequence in front of a skeptical world and say, "Look." Inside the shelter, surrounded by preserved artifacts and the mute dignity of living things, the camera had another form. It was a tool with consequences. The film in our packs could become evidence, yes, but it could also become a map written in light and silver that would lead predatory men to this little sheltered world. There is a weight that comes with seeing. What you do with the sight changes the future in ways you cannot completely predict. We slept under the shelter's outer lip that night with the fire banked low and my hands on my notebook. I wrote nothing in it at first. The sound of the forest was thick and unhurried. The shelter breathed small noises, someone stirring a bundle, the gentle sound of cloth rubbing against skin. In the dark I thought of my grandfather's line, "Keep it from prying eyes." It was a moral proposition then, simple and terrible. Early the next morning, Thray brought out a roll of drawings and unrolled them like a story. They were careful panels of daily life, planting, teaching, children playing with carved sticks, elders teaching songs. In the middle of the roll there was a sequence that tightened my chest. A row of men with guns, then a doorway with people pressed inside it, then the sequence of a rotor overhead. The technique was painstaking. The lines of the rotor were repeated dozens of times in a kind of obsessive circling. At the edge of one panel, there was a small figure with hands upturned, and above it a notation in the margins, a symbol that Kura and Thri used to mark harm. They pointed this to us and the gesture was clear. It was evidence of collective memory. We asked carefully about the book margins and the press newspapers. Using the little pigeon we had developed, sign for time, point for now, draw for remember, Kura took the book and flipped it to a page where a naturalist had sketched a plant with notes on its uses. Kura tapped the plant, then tapped the drawing of a helicopter. He tapped his chest, then ours. We inferred the inference. Contact, curiosity, violence, recording. It was not a conspiracy. It was history kept like a wound. We shared something then we had not planned to share. Our food. It was a small packet of beans and a hardtack biscuit that had seen better days. Thri broke the hardtack with surprising delicacy and offered me half. I took it with the same reverence I would a votive. In the exchange, there was trust being formed against the long background of fear and memory. They drew while we ate, small, spare lines, and showed a circle where our footprints had been, along with two human figures laid beside two tall ones with a line connecting them. He tapped his heart and then tapped our hands. The meaning was as plain as it was fragile. We belonged to one another in some nascent way. Kura did not speak as we do, but he had a voice. At times he produced low tones that vibrated through his chest in a pattern that had internal punctuation and cadence. He used those sounds to set time, to count movement, to invoke names that were not ours to keep. It wasn't English, and it wasn't any dialect we could map onto a chart. It was presence. It insisted on being heard as such. Vince, who had spent nights under different skies, said once, "They've got a culture. They hold the past the way we hold photographs." It was an observation wrapped in a soldier's economy of words. The cameras we had pinned up like small moons around that pocket of forest did their work whether or not we intended it. The telephoto on the ridge had taken steady frames of the approach. It had caught the way Kura would lean out and use his hands to shade his eyes and study the distant horizons. The Super 8 had recorded the soft motion of Thray's hands as he drew. Those frames, when projected later in dim rooms, would feel intimate to an almost unbearable degree. There was a shot of Thray pausing and looking into the lens, not with the raw fear we might expect from an animal, but with a kind of self-awareness that made his drawn figure look back at his own life. That frame is the one I would soon refuse to let be shown without context. When we finally left that initial clearing, after 2 days of exchange and more than 200 frames of stills and reels, Vince and I sat aside and argued like men who had found something precious and were trying to decide whether to hide it under their coats or put it on a pedestal. "We prove this," Vince said at one point, voice tight with a man who has seen the leverage of a camera in the hands of the wrong people. "We get it to the right institutions. We put it in front of scientists." He counted off reasons with the precise rhythm of a drill sergeant. Verification, legacy, the chance to force ethics into policy. The list was solid on its face. I wanted to answer with the sound of the shelter, the hush, the tapestries of memory, the printed clippings with the word hunters scrawled across them. I wanted to imagine the cameras we had set as guardians rather than exposures. There is a difference between proving a thing and protecting a thing. Both are acts of love, but they pull in opposite directions. We returned the following week. When we came back to that lee side, the cameras had captured something we hadn't expected. There were fresh prints near the ridge path, and the telephoto stills showed a new line of poles knocked down in the distance. The cedar camera's film had been disturbed in a way that said not curiosity but caution. Punctured frames, a smear of hair caught on the housing. It was a rude, intimate touch. Whoever or whatever had been there had inspected our equipment with fingers that left behind that same fine fur. On a dull afternoon, after a day of careful observation, we followed a new track that led away from the shelter to a narrow cave tucked behind a fallen boulder. Kura and Thray walked with us to the mouth as if to introduce us to something that had been waiting for guests for a long time. Inside, the air was cool and musty and smelled faintly of resin. A shaft of light from the cave mouth let dust float like stars. Kura gestured we enter and pointed to the wall. What we found on the stone was not simply art. It was a library of living memory. Panels covered the rock, some faint as a whisper, some freshly drawn. There were scenes of abundance, people harvesting, building, fishing, and of ritual, figures with drums and necklaces. And then there were darker panels. Men with rifles, traps, a mechanized shape in the sky. Figures being herded into enclosures. The representation was not rudimentary. It was as sophisticated as any of the books on Kura's shelf. There were sequences that looked like maps, coastlines transforming into inland lines, icons that might be compass points, and in one corner, a mark that recurred. The same mark that had been in the margins of the naturalist's book and on the newspaper print. Someone had circled certain points and painted small X's beside them. The cave drawings told a story of contact and persecution across decades. They were not, in my mind, evidence of some supernatural force. They were evidence of history. Men came by air and sea with tools and nets. Men herded, trapped, shot. The pictures were not gory. They were precise. And in the quiet geometry of the panels, the intent was clear. The banded sequences around the cave entrance suggested that the attackers came not in a single decade, but across generations. Kura sat before one panel and made a low series of sounds, the pattern of his voice tracing the panels with an almost liturgical reverence. He pointed to a small drawing near the edge, a human figure with a hat and a note beside it. The note, drawn not in ink, but with a battered piece of charcoal, looked like words. 3 picked up a scrap of paper and held it up. On it, in a European hand, was scribbled an address, a coastal town, a date. The handwriting matched that which had been in the margins of the books. It matched the scrawl over the hunter photo. We sat in that cave for a long time. The cameras we had left outside had, by then, recorded a sequence. A blurred frame of a figure at the shelter lip, a narrow frame roll of Three's hands as he painted, and a grainy telephoto strip of Kura walking the ridge at dusk. What the footage would finally show, if it were ever seen by people who didn't understand the cost, was a family making home amid the memory of violence. Those images, candid and small, were the kind of thing that would cause people to cry or to plot. They were not neutral. At dusk, we left the cave and walked back through the forest. The rhythm of the day had thickened into a pressure. I found myself thinking of my grandfather's journal and how carefully he had pointed measurements and margins toward a protective secrecy. "Keep it from prying eyes," he had written. I understood that sentence differently now. That night the sound came from far off at first, like a breeze turned metallic. I had heard the noise 6 times in my life before I knew what it was. The thin, rolling wash that suggests a rotor far beyond the ridge. In the clearing, Kura looked up. His body didn't tense. It folded into a sort of patient sadness. He touched the ground where the men in the picture had been standing and then, with a slow, deliberate motion, traced a concentric circle in the dirt. Vince and I didn't sleep then. We sat with our backs against the rough bark and watched as the shelter burned a small, controlled, smoky light. The creatures moved with a practiced economy. They took down the plates and wrapped the books in oiled cloth and tucked them again in the hollow. In the dimness, I took a frame that would later be argued over. Kura cradling an old paper, the paper cradling a childlike drawing, Kura's thumb pressing the corner as if to smooth a hurt. The sound grew nearer. It had a depth that unsettled wood and stone, a rolling that made small animals call and then fall silent. There was nothing noble in the noise. It was the sound of machines making short work of a sky. We had seen the rotor in the cave drawings. Now we could hear the thing making the same punctuation in the real world. Vince held my shoulder and said the thing I later realized we both needed. We can't let this be what exposes them. It was not the language of heroism. It was the language of someone who has watched how cameras can become compasses for men with money and motives. He had seen the way an image can be turned into a chase. He had seen men who would look at a photograph and think it nothing but a map. When the light of the machine finally broke the tree line, it was not a thunder that arrived, but a low, invasive buzz. Its distance was deceptive. The sound could be heard even when the machine itself was out of sight. We lay flat in the shelter's shadow and pulled hides up like blankets. Kura and Threy moved with us into a practiced stillness. The creatures knew how to vanish in plain sight. The camera on the ridge kept rolling, as it were. Film, once left to do its job, is stubborn. The telephoto had captured the machine as a smudge against the pale sky, and then, in a later frame, the rotor blades thrown into high-contrast streaks that looked like the chapters of a badly printed newspaper. There was a single frame where a small dark object tumbled from the undercarriage and hit the ground in a plume of dust. When we later examined the frame with the lightbox in a safe place, the object could not be identified. It was only a dark shape. That ambiguity would later fuel many kinds of speculation, and for a while it was all we had. When the sound drew too close for comfort, the shelter became a lesson in silence. Kura took a handful of dried moss and rubbed it like an offering into the hollows of our boots, removing scent where possible. He balled up our print impressions with his hands and flattened them over roots. The creature's method of disappearance was not simply to run. It was to unclench the world until it forgot. There is a particular terror in trying to make the world forget you. We held our breath until the rotors passed. Then we stayed quiet for a long time after, listening for any reply that never came. The machine's sound shrank slowly down the valley and carried away the final rasp of the evening like a closing door. While the forest resumed its ordinary noises, bugs, the distant rustle of deer, there was a new sourness in our mouths. That evening, consumed by the shelter's low light, we argued not about what to reveal, but how to protect. "I don't want us to be the reason these pictures exist as a hunt," Vince said finally. He tapped the film canister at his side. "We make a record. We don't make a treasure map." We agreed then on the edge of decisions we would come to wear like armor, that if we were to preserve evidence we would do so with care. We would digitize nothing. There was no such thing to do in 1977 in the field, but we would create an archive, sealed and time-stamped, and we would commit to guardianship. We would, in the simplest terms, keep the film and the prints away from anyone who might follow them with the wrong motive. It was a modest vow in the shadow of what I now knew to be a large truth. If the rotors returned, if men with nets and cages and contracts came again, the shelter would not stand. That night I slept with the book of natural history in my arms as if it were a child's toy, and in the morning I woke with a kindness I had not known I could hold. The kindness was not heroic. It was domestic. It was the kind of loyalty that grows when somebody shares their bread with you. Across the weeks that followed, we became less like intruders and more like the odd members of a household. Our cameras continued, but we changed how we used them. Instead of throwing film at moments, we learned to hold back and take one honest frame. The Super 8 reels recorded rituals, Kura making a small mouth instrument, 3 drawing a sun in a way that made us all laugh softly, and they recorded things that were not performative. The way Kura's hands trembled when he looked at an old clipped photograph, the small half-smile that slid over 3's face when he found a new piece of charcoal to draw with. It is one thing to watch from afar with a telephoto. It is another to be trusted enough to be fed the same soup. Trust changes the way a camera looks at a subject. When a lens becomes a witness instead of an accusation, it frames intimacy rather than spectacle. We learned to point our cameras at the hearth and away from the ridge. We learned that the most consequential frames might be the ones that would never leave that place. But the cave's gallery kept echoing in our heads. Each layered panel suggested more than memory. It hinted at a network. There were marks on the margins of certain drawings, coordinates drawn as sigils, if you will, marks that suggested other sites. There were sequences of figures moving south along a coastline and then inland along rivers. In one faded corner, someone had sketched a rough map with a dotted line and small circles. If it was a map, it was crude. If it was a notice, it was a prayer. We kept that knowledge between us like an ember. To reveal it would be to hand an instruction manual to hunters and collectors. To silence it would be to bear the weight of others' anonymity. Vince and I, who had both been trained to observe and report, now had to refuse a part of our training. We turned the film canisters over in our hands and learned how secrecy could be stewardship rather than cowardice. On a late August morning, as the air turned thin and a northern chill touched the leaves, Kura took from inside one of the bundle-wrapped books a single folded scrap of paper. It was a corner of a page from an old expedition ledger. Someone, perhaps a sympathetic hand long ago, had copied a crude notation into the margin. Another coastal village, a date, and beside it a symbol identical to the one repeated in the cave. When Kura unfolded it and pressed it to the stone, his chest rose with a slow breath like wind over a low hill. He drew with a stick on the ground and circled a point, then pointed east. He looked at me and without words he made a motion to indicate leaving. The meaning was clear as the noon sun. This is not an island. There are more like us. There are other pockets, other families, and some of them might still be findable. What the cameras had captured was more than domestic intimacy. They had captured proof. Proof of culture, proof of persecution, proof of a network, proof that could save or ruin. We found ourselves at a crossroads that had nothing to do with fame and everything to do with protection. The frames in our hands that night, 3's drawing with the dotted line, Kura's folded scrap, were the same frames that would force us into decisions we were not ready to make. There was the possibility of rescue, of reunification, perhaps even of sanctuary and remote preserves. There was, equally, the possibility of being the architects of exposure. We covered the photographs in oilcloth and sealed the film cans inside a rusting lunch pail that we shoved into a root cellar and buried under a tangle of bracken. We marked the place only with a tiny scratch on a rock. It felt petty and vital at once. I think of that hiding place often. It was the first time I accepted the role that would come to define the next 5 years of my life. Guardian. That evening, after the shelter had been tidied and another small meal shared, 3 set out a new drawing. He worked quickly, hands sure and small, and then held it out for us to see. The panel showed 2 large lumbering shapes crossing a river and passing a small village. On the far side, near the river's bend, there was a small cluster of dots with an X through them. Thari tapped that X hard with his finger, as if to emphasize its import. Kura made low sounds and his face twisted into something that might be translated as sorrow. He rapped his knuckles on his chest and then pointed at us. We understood, with a clarity that had nothing to do with language, that we were not merely witnesses. We had become part of the covenant. The footage we had taken, frames of woven shelves and of Three's delicate pencil strokes, were not destined for a museum. They were evidence and a responsibility. When we left the next morning, we carried with us not only canisters of film, but a folded map in Three's hand, a sleep in our bones, and an awareness that what had been captured by chance and kindness had the power to alter lives. We walked away with a pact formed in silence. We would keep their secret, and we would, in private, study the markers that might point to others. We would become keepers, in the old sense of the word. The cameras, we learned, had taken more than we had intended. Among the frames there were images of a hand smoothing a brow, of a small carved doll being passed from finger to finger, of a child's mouth forming the sound of a word I could not repeat. There were also frames that recorded evidence of aggression, not graphical, but schematic. Men in circles, traps shown in crude detail, and one plate where a human figure pointed with a stick at a group of tall shapes, and then at a little enclosure. Those frames were like a ledger in the dark. We tied the film and the photographs to our consciences as if they were infants. We promised ourselves to treat them like living things, and yet even promise and care could not stop the world from intruding. The story was not ours alone to tell, and the frames we had were not ours to keep from consequence forever. The telephoto captured, later that month, a shadow on the slope that we could not explain. A group of men, blurred by distance but clearly moving in a small line. Whether they were hunters or surveyors we could not say with certainty from the grainy negatives. The cave's panels, the book margins, and an old clipping about bounties all pushed me toward the same narrow conclusion. This was not a passing curiosity. It was a history, a threaded series of encounters, often violent, that had been preserved by those who had lived through them. In the weeks that followed, we doubled back again and again. Sometimes we left more material for them, spare tools, a coil of rope, a coil of wire that might be used in some repair. These small interventions were made with the best intentions, but they also tightened the moral knot we had tied for ourselves. We were no longer alone in the weight of knowledge. One late afternoon, as we were finishing a sketch for our own notebook, Kura took my hand and pressed the folded scrap of the coastal ledger into my palm. He did not say anything in words I understood. He looked into my eyes with a gravity that felt like a benediction, and an indictment rolled into one. It was an asking, not a command. Will you carry this forward? Will you be the ones who decide? I thought then not of being famous, but of being faithful. I thought of my grandfather's line again and felt it like a whispered instruction. Keep it from prying eyes. I tasted the word keep as one might taste salt after a wound, necessary, immediate, and certain. We left the clearing that evening with the cameras still in place and the hush of the forest like a promise between us. The footage we had would come back with us in rolls of film and developed prints. They would show domestic tenderness, they would show the careful archive, and they would show marks of old hunts, pictures and marginalia that read like pleas. They would be powerful in ways the world has language for, and dangerous in ways the world does not. When we packed our gear and set the last canister into the canvas bag, I turned and looked at the shelter one more time. Kura stood at the lip and lifted his hand in a slow arc. The gesture wasn't goodbye. It was an invitation. To return, to guard, to learn. This is where, for the moment, we stood, with the knowledge of the cave and the drawings and with film in our backpacks that could be a proof or a weapon. We had set cameras deep in Bigfoot territory, and the footage that existed had already changed us. It had revealed not monsters but neighbors. It had given us a choice, to tell the world and risk turning a life into a chase, or to bury the truth and become its custodians. The film would not let us sleep. It would not let us be neutral. And in the weeks that followed, the decision we made in that shelter would shape everything that came after. We did not leave the valley and come back as if nothing had happened. Once you carry a secret like that, the shape of a life, the sound of a song you didn't know you would love, you begin to notice how your days cleave differently. The first months after our vow were measured in small, practical things. How to mend a snapped tripod leg with a strip of leather. How to splice a torn negative with gaffer tape in a trembling hand. How to bury a canister so the frost wouldn't crack the emulsion. But the larger changes were quieter and slower. They took root in the way I learned the cadence of Kura's low hums, and the way Vince's shoulders uncoiled each time someone in the shelter laughed. We moved from being visitors who took pictures to being residents with duties. There was a rhythm to guardianship that felt at times like a second job, constant and tender. We kept watch on the approaches. We learned which ridgelines threw sound and which swallowed it. We expanded the hiding places for film, a jam tin with a false bottom, a seam in the rock behind a lichen patch, a false root that hung over a drainage. We never recorded everything. That would have been the easy cowardice of believing the world should have access to what it did not respect. We made our records with the intent of preservation, not publicity. There were supply runs to plan. In the late summer of 1978, Vince and I learned how to drive 3 towns over with film and nothing like an anxious expression. We bought bolts, needles, cartridge casings that could be refashioned into awls, a spool of copper wire for repairing a bent bow. We traded photographs for canned goods when people didn't ask questions. We traded anonymity for the kindness of small-town hardware men who thought we were surveying game trails. Vinegar and sugar made for long-term preservation. Oilcloth kept the pages of Kura's books from rotting. We learned the currency of a place where currency meant kindness over curiosity. The exchange with Kura and Thray deepened in strange and beautiful ways. They taught us to watch the land with fingers more than with eyes. Thray taught me how to mix ochre with an animal fat to make a paint that would stick through winter rain. Vince, with a patience born of long nights in foxholes and late evenings in dark rooms, taught Kura how to bend a bit of wire into a makeshift hinge, how to lubricate an axial mount so the lens would pan without catching. Once, late into an autumn dusk, Kura handed Vince a strip of bark and, with 2 precise licks of his thumb, showed him how to smooth it into a crude sandpaper. That bark came back to me months later in the form of a repaired tripod foot that saved the tilt while Vince shot a reel of 3 whittling by lamplight. We were learning one another in practical terms and also in the private grammar of affection. The Bigfoot people, no one had taught me how to speak that label without feeling like I had swallowed someone else's insult, had ways of marking intimacy that were not the same as ours but were as deep. Kura had a way of arranging stones by the hearth to designate whom one's protection covered. The placement of a flat with a burn mark meant guest. A larger stone with a notch meant kin. 3 who loved small things kept a line of carved toys by the sleeping area. A bird, a fish, a human figure with long arms. Once, when a fox stole one of those carved birds at twilight, Kura went out and retrieved it with a patience that made me think of a man going to pull a child's blanket from off a face. Over the winters we recorded songs and the rustle of pages in books. We learned haltingly how to exchange instruction. I taught 3 the basic mechanics of a 35mm camera, how to feel the shutter, how to listen for the cadence of the metering tick. He taught me to feel the resonance of a plant without breaking it, to know the taste of a root that eases cramps and the smell of moss that tells you where water will sit after a rain. We found that knowledge rarely stayed purely biological or purely mechanical. It braided. A camera became not merely a thing to make images, but a means by which we could demonstrate gentleness, how to hold, how to steady, how to let something small be the subject and not a trophy. We also began to see more clearly the scale of what the cave drawings hinted at. In late 1979, a winter with harsh sleet and long nights, Kura unfurled a fold that had been sewn into a bundle years before, pages from a ledger, water-damaged but legible. On those pages someone had copied names and dates of ports and small notations, times when ships called near the coast, scribbles that might have been commerce listings or the names of men who had come ashore. In the margins, small crosses marked certain entries. Kura traced a cross and tapped the page, then tapped the horizon, and the implication was clear. Movement. People had been moving along the edges of coasts and rivers, and the Bigfoot people had watched and recorded the comings and goings as carefully as they had observed birds. We thought then that if there were other pockets, their survival would depend on silence to the same degree as ours. That knowledge forced us to be more ingenious about the ways we protected things. We developed a method of duplicating certain key images onto low-contrast prints and storing them in separate caches. If one hiding place were found, the information would not all be lost. We buried negatives under river stones. We sewed strips of film into the hems of covers that lined older pack frames. We made an index in a notebook coded only by symbol and shape so that if the worst happened, there would be a trail that only we might follow, if we ever decided to. The threat did not remain abstract. In the spring of 1980, after a long thaw, a passage of 3 days became one of the closest calls we ever had. It began as a line of movement on the ridge caught by the telephoto, grainy forms that might have been deer at first but moved too straight for ungulates. Vince, always the first to let his training speak, said nothing at first but set the telephoto to a longer exposure and thumbed wind onto the film to steady the shimmer. I watched the frames come back in the little dark tent we used as a processing nook. Frames of men, hats low, imagined gait too purposeful for chance. We did not confront them. We couldn't. The shelter taught us the art of not being seen by those who had edges to their profession. That night Kura gathered everyone and led them in a ritual of stillness. The ritual was not superstitious. It was practice. A rehearsal of silence in which the community learned to become a portion of the forest's background. We lay flat under hides while above us a low droning started a long way off. When the first machine passed overhead, the forest changed the way it did the first time we'd been there. Animals stilled. Wind seemed to slow. Even breath felt like a loud thing to hide. The telephoto had, as it were, betrayed a thing we did not want betrayed. In the frames we later examined, the men on the ridge were carrying devices that glinted, metal in the sun. But whether they were surveyors or hired hunters could not be said with certainty. The camera could only record. It could not read motive. We took the image as evidence that people were actively moving into the valley in organized ways. Whether government contractors or private teams, the fact remained. They were looking, and their looking followed trails similar to the ones the cave drawings had warned of. On one of the subsequent close calls, we lost a man who had been with us for 3 seasons. A tall figure with a gentle laugh who'd come north seeking work and stayed because he'd discovered something he couldn't explain. He was a hunter by trade who had come to help men's nets and had gone out one morning to check a set of snares by the lower marsh. We buried him simply, and while there had been no violence in his passing, the event left a hollow around which the shelter gathered to mourn. The cave drawings' panels of loss were not just images now. They were memory and metaphor combined. We learned to sorrow carefully so as not to break the delicate instrument of communal life. The film we kept recorded both these quiet lives and the encroachments. There are reels that show Kura teaching a group to weave strips of birch into a panel. The camera rolls, and you can hear the hum of someone singing a rhythm that measures the time it takes to pull a strip through another. On another reel, the telephoto catches, far on the ridge, a rectangle of glare that might be a lens or a metal plate, something that suggests human activity, and then a blur of rotors ascending like a question mark. Those frames, when projected in the dark, never failed to empty the shelter. They were the kind of images that made you sleep like a man with a hand outstretched to catch a falling child. We began to draw boundaries around what could ever be shown and what must remain buried. I remember once, after a long season, watching a Super 8 reel that Vince had taken of 3 at dusk. The light was thin and blue, 3 held a small wooden figure and began with steady fingertips to carve a tiny mouth. The film captured the motion so precisely that the sound of the blade on wood seemed to echo in the projector room like a memory. There was a frame, just one, that showed 3 look straight into the lens and, with his small carved thing held up, offer it in a gesture that looked like a handshake. Vince, who was watching with me, turned the projector off then and left the rest of the reel in the machine. "Not now," he said. "Not for them." That was the new rule. Just because the camera had taken something did not mean that thing had to enter the world. And yet the world kept rearranging itself into peril. By late 1981, the lines began to look less accidental and more systematic. We noted patterns in the rotor passes, evenings when the machines came in a low sweep, and mornings when they snapped vertical and were gone. From the telephoto frames we could see when the rotors cast long shadows that cut across known approach routes. There were new tracks in the snow that spoke of 4-wheeled vehicles. A photograph from a month later showed, blurred by distance but unmistakable by proportion, a line of men with packs moving in a deliberate arc along a creek. The cave's images, composed of charcoal and memory, now had a contemporary echo. It was during one of these tense years that Kura brought out the map that changed everything again. He had kept it folded within a leather-bound volume, a naturalist's plate book from the late 1800s that somebody had slipped into a pack long ago. I had handled that book many times. It was thin with the taste of flint and old glue. On one rainy afternoon when the rain was hard enough to make the shelter feel like a separate world, Kura unfolded the page and smoothed it on the stone. The map was not a cartographer's masterpiece. It was a collection of marks, a network of small circles and dashed lines. But when he tapped a point with his knuckle and then traced a line toward the coast, his meaning was plain. There were other pockets, others who had managed to survive. What struck us was not just the existence of other bands but the way these places were marked in the margins. Tiny symbols that matched the repeated mark in the cave, the same sign that had been scribbled beside bounties and beside notations in harbor ledgers. Someone somewhere had been trying to keep a record of friendly sites, of places where one might find food and shelter and not bullets. It was an index, the sort of thing you would make if you wanted to hold together a scattered family. We argued, as men who now bore guardianship must argue, about what to do. To go find others would be to risk them. To do nothing would be to let them remain isolated and subject to the whims of chance. The map offered hope and danger in equal measure. Vince, who had been pushed through so many moral sluices in his life, laid out the options in a way that made all of us pause. "We can ignore it and hope they find each other," he said. "We can go and break their silence. Or we can try to make allies quietly, vets, anthropologists, people who won't turn curiosity into vendetta." None of us liked the choices. Kura's face, which had hardly changed over years, softened into something that looked like prayer. He tapped the map, then tapped each of our chests. He was asking, simply, for what humans have been asked for since they first traded seed. "Will you help us be a family again?" We began to plan in the only way we could, slowly in ways designed to leave no trail. That meant learning to read the difference between tracks left by a man and tracks left by a machine. It meant practicing leaving false traces, not in the sense of instruction to a stranger, but as a method of protection. A scattering of non-essential prints to confuse a line of searchers while the true group pulled away. We rehearsed movement without leaving signs, but I will not give instruction like that here. Only to say we learned, and those lessons were paid for in sleepless nights. In the spring of 1982, the shelter's small community came to a decision. Kura, who had aged in the way elders do when they carry memory, called us together and tapped the map. He pointed to a cluster of marks 2 days' travel to the south, other pockets. He touched the symbol that meant movement, and then tapped his chest and ours. The resolve was not theatrical. It was quiet and deliberate. They wanted to know who among their kin remained, and they wanted to build lines of safety. We attached the camera gear to the tree with extra care that morning. The telephoto was fitted with a newly fashioned hood to cut glare. The Super 8 was loaded with fresh stock. Vince and I checked exposure and lens creaks as one checks a child's heartbeat. We were not heading out as exhibitionists. We were going as cautious emissaries. The plan was to travel light, to blur our trail as best we could, and to bring with us only the essentials: knowledge of how to treat a swollen ankle, a small cache of preserved foods, and a folded series of photographs that might be carried as testimony, not advertisement. There was a tension that rode with us like a shadow. In the week before we left, we noticed that the pattern of rotor passes tightened. The machines slept in the sky over the valley at odd hours, and once, just after dusk, we saw a light sweep the shelter from a distance that felt like a hand passing near the throat. A frame from the telephoto taken that night shows a row of lights moving in geometric, intentional formation. There were men in lines once more, but now they traveled with gear that suggested a capacity for detention rather than mere curiosity. The photographs did not say, "They will capture," but the implication was heavy. On the morning we left, Kura pressed an envelope into my hands. Inside were copies of several of the best-preserved fragments of the cave drawings, folded and wrapped in oilcloth. They were not to be used carelessly, he indicated with his hands and a slow set of low tones. He gestured for secrecy, for a cautious kind of faith. He held my hands then, palms up, and in the quiet way elders have of passing something to those they authorize, he put his blessing into me. We carried the film with the same reverence. Every now and then I would reach into my pack and feel the canisters roll beneath my fingers as if they were small sleeping things. There were images that made my throat tighten. Kura smoothing a child's hair in a frame so grainy it had become a blur, Three's delicate lines of a coastline, the protective oval of a shelter hearth. Those frames were our proof and our burden. We traveled for days through country that friends of civilization would call unremarkable and which, in the language of the valley, was full of markers. We avoided main roads, used the cover of rain, and kept to the kinds of canyons that ate sound. Every so often we would stop and use the telephoto to scan for signs of machine movement. A glint, a smudge on a ridge, the telltale path of disturbed undergrowth. Once on a high pass we saw the suggestion of a footprint as wide as a tray that headed down a drainage away from our line. It was a reminder that this was not just our adventure, but other people's daily life in a fragile form. The map led us to a small creek where the presence of other beings was implied by the careful arrangement of stones and the remains of a woven reed mat. The camp there was quiet, but signs of life were all around. Shavings of wood from recent working, a small line of bird bones strung like beads, a rudimentary ladder leaned against a low bank. We did not rush into the clearing. Kura sent Thray forward with a small offering, a carved fish, tied into a strip of leather. There walked with the kind of step that made shape of peace. What followed was not the neat cinematic meeting some imagination might expect. There were mistrustful glances, a slow circling. At one point a child, no more than a few winters old, slipped out into the open like a bird daring the wind and stood between us all. Three put his hand over his mouth in a kind of instinctual joy and then sat down and drew the child in an ochre circle on the ground. For a long suspended moment there was a common language, small offerings, drawings, the exchange of food. Then the elders of the camp stepped forward. They were wary. They inspected the pages Kura produced. They touched the margin signs and looked at the faces of Vince and me with the weight of judgment. We did not stay long. The visit was enough to know these were kin. It was enough to know their hunger for safety. It was enough to know the stakes. We left with a folded scrap in Thray's hand from that camp, a drawing of a river mouth and 3 X's near it. It was a code, a direction, a point of hope. We walked back with the map and the new scrap and a heavy quiet in our bones. We returned to our shelter with the knowledge that we had done something pivotal and precarious. We had seen enough to know there were at least 2 other sites and perhaps more. We now had an actionable promise, to find them or to fail trying. But we also had the knowledge that any misstep could turn the map in our hands into a set of coordinates for people who tracked by the stiff mechanics of money and contracts. In the months that followed, the pressure increased. A contractors team, anonymous in the paperwork we'd later see in a wet clipping buried in another shelter, came to a small township near the valley and took a photograph of a sign, an X, painted on a fence line, before leaving. Whether they were looking for resources, for specimens, or for showmanship, no one could say for sure. What we did know was that money and query had a way of recruiting crude curiosity into organized effort. We changed tactics. We began to move the most sensitive film off-site in pieces. Some negatives hidden in a bag of feed at an unremarkable farm we paid with a trade of repair work. Others sewn into a double seam on a coat that was later left at a bus station with a note for a friend. The idea was to fragment the archive so that no one discovery could produce a map. It was messy, and it cost us time, but it bought us breathing room. By the winter of 1982, we were thinking in terms of a limited expedition. A small, discreet party who would attempt to contact other sites, to leave markers that only kin could read, and to return without leaving coordinates behind. We knew that if we were found, the cost could be the end of the small world that had entrusted itself to us. We also knew that if we did nothing, that world could be strangled by indifference or moved into captivity. The cameras, for their part, continued to make the argument that words could not. There was a reel that Vince took in the early morning when the sun had that hard, low light that makes everything seem carved. 3 sits on a log and draws with a charcoal that leaves soft dust on his knuckles. At one point the Super 8 flickers and Threy looks up and presses the drawing toward the lens, as if to show not just what he made but who he was. The frame is so intimate that it reads less like evidence than an invitation. There are frames of Kura rocking a small child like a man with too much tenderness for one life to hold. There is a grainy still where Kura smooths a scrap of paper with a thumbnail and then sets it between 2 stones as if it were a relic. Those images haunted us. They were our proof and our mercy. They were also proof that could be misread by people who view tenderness as opportunity. We kept them locked away, and the secrecy gave us strange gifts, a sense of fierce, private stewardship, and a grief that did not have an audience. We were learning to be guardians in the old sense, those who hold another's survival within the small decisions of daily life. In the closing months before we set out on the larger expedition, our plan to find other pockets, we compiled what we could: copies of the best images, a distilled map stitched out of various scraps, notes on the marks that would identify friendly camps. We wrapped those items in oilcloth and placed them into a metal box that we disguised as a mundane tool container. Kura and Threy watched the packing with a seriousness that made the whole act feel ceremonial. The morning we left, the valley was white with a thin blue frost. Kura stood at the lip of the shelter and gave us a slow bow with both hands to his heart. Thyr pressed a fresh drawing into my palm, one that showed 4 figures in a circle with a single bright line cutting like a path away. It was an insistence: go, but come back if you can. Vince checked the cameras one last time and then, almost as an afterthought, he said, "If anything goes wrong, you 2 know how to keep them hidden. Hide the film, not the truth." He didn't elaborate. There was no need. It was the kind of thing men who have seen the ways information can become violence know deeply. We departed that day with hearts like stones. We did not carry a publicist's swagger. We carried a commitment to secrecy. If there was a quiet heroism to be had in the world, it was in the small acts: to tell a lie to protect a life, to bury an image so it cannot be used against its maker, to keep someone else's history from being mined for profit. The expedition that followed is a story of narrow escapes and improbable kindnesses. We found another camp, smaller and more hidden, where the people were skittish and distrustful at first. There were offers of food and small trades of tools. We brought news, and the news traveled like a low, reassuring hum. At one of those camps, an elder pressed a carved stick into Kura's hands and pointed to the symbol on our map, as if to say, "We know. We've been waiting." They had survived by being almost invisible, burying their smoke, changing their paths, moving at night when necessary. They had their own archive of cave art and pressed clippings sewn into bundles. We did not rejoice publicly. We made notes and left with hearts heavy with the knowledge that we had placed more than hope in the field. Back at our shelter, we added the new scraps to the old map and began, in private, to plan for the next steps. If there was to be any larger pivot, appealing to people to protect certain lands or to seek sanctuary in protected preserves, we agreed it must happen without exposing exact coordinates. It would require allies we could trust, people who had the legal and ethical will to push against greed. And such people were hard to find. That is where the cameras resumed a different kind of duty. We used them to make a precisely framed archive, not the kind of footage that would invite foolish glory, but the kind that would serve in a legal and ethical future as evidence of sentience, culture, and persecution. We shot sequences that documented tool use, song structures, care of the young, and the archived clippings and drawings that told of raids and rotors. Each reel was labeled, sealed, and placed into the metal box under oilcloth. We photographed the handwriting and margins. We made lists of names and put them into cipher. We never left a single roll exposed longer than necessary, and then, just as we were gearing toward a longer campaign of cautious outreach, we felt the horizon change. The rotor sounds that had previously come as occasional punctuations now arrived, with an intention that suggested a directed search. The patterns of flight tightened. One morning, coming back from a cache, Vince and I found a perimeter of small snare-like devices set in a line where no tracks had been before. They were crude and clearly meant to trap a foot wide and heavy. Someone had been testing the valley for the right method of capture. We dismantled them and left after covering the ground with a scatter of leaves. We could have chosen to follow and find the origin men. We chose instead to make the valley forget us as best we could. The cameras recorded a frame of the devices at dawn before we removed them. That negative sits still in oilcloth when I think of it. An image of one of the ways the world invents new mechanisms to take the lives of what it calls other. By the time we decided to take the next step, an expedition to one of the coastal points marked with an X, the stakes could be felt in the air. The map had become an instrument of hope and danger. We knew, with a certain cold clarity, that moving would expose us. We also knew, with equal clarity, that not moving could doom others. We made final preparations in secret. The day before we left, Kura took me aside and slid into my hand another small envelope. Inside was a fragment of a photograph, the image of a machine over a field that we had pulled from a book long ago. Kura had pressed his thumb over the corner until it had left a small crescent oil mark. He nodded to me and then to the shelter, and made a motion like a line across the chest. Guard. And then a motion toward the horizon with a steady hand. It was not a command, but a plea. We left at first light. The cameras were left to do a different job, to act as sentinels. We positioned 2 stills with telephotos in vantage points that would not reveal much but might show the approach lines of machines. We planted a Super 8 with a trigger that would record motion under moonlight, crude but serviceable. We did not leave film in obvious places. We took with us only what we could carry without making a show. The journey to the coastal X's was one of the most delicate things I have ever done. We moved with slow, deliberate steps across places that felt full of eyes. When we reached one of the points, the camp there was proof of what the cave walls had been saying for decades. People living as quietly as possible, keeping their fires low, using the sea to feed a small band. They received us with an economy of gestures, and we traded news and a handful of preserves. We stayed only a short while and then left, knowing that the best outcome would be to sow the seeds of a network without drawing a thread too taut. On our return, as dusk settled like a hand over the valley, Vince and I used the telephoto to scan the ridges. In a faint line on a distant slope, we saw the glint of metal and, for a moment, the unmistakable sweep of rotor wash. The machines had found a way to make their presence felt where before they had flown above. They were different now. They moved like parties with purpose, their ground teams probing. The frames from that dusk showed a line of men and a canvas that suggested cages. We stared at those negatives until our eyes blurred. The world we had tried to keep small was being reconsidered by a broader ambition. We returned, and the shelter's mood hardened like clay left to the sun. There was a new urgency. The elders met and, in their way, voted, not with words but with rituals and gestures, on steps to take to protect other sites and to make the valley less likely to be traced by human instruments. We agreed to prepare for movement if necessary, to disperse caches, to make the valley a less reliable map for those who would convert curiosity into capture. The cameras had recorded it all, the sound of rotors, the smudged frames of men on a ridge, home life, the cave drawings, the map. They had captured domestic tenderness and evidentiary proof. They had, in a sense, witnessed the moral debate and the shifting shapes of our decisions. Each frame held its own kind of power, the power to move public opinion, the power to make hunters determined, the power to create allies. The last night before we set out on the plan to try to shepherd a group of families to safety, Kura called us to the central hearth and placed, with hands that trembled only slightly, a single old photograph on the flat stone. It was a print of a line of men in a plain field, cameras slung over shoulders with a helicopter's shadow falling across the image. Across the top, someone had scrawled with a heavy stroke, "Hunters." Kura tapped the photo and then tapped the stone where the camera had been placed. He pointed at the image and then at the camera, and then to Vince and me, and the meaning was as plain as a bell. Remember the danger. Remember the tenderness. We packed the last of the films that night. I wrapped my hand around a canister as if it were a child's fist. There is a queer kind of intimacy that grows between you and the records you make, between the sound of the shutter and the memory it keeps. I thought, with a precise sadness of my grandfather's marginal lines, "Keep it from prying eyes." I felt the weight of that line now as if it had been cemented into my bones. We left the shelter before dawn and moved like a rumor through the trees. The expedition that followed was not concluded in the tidy way stories in pulp magazines conclude. We succeeded in bringing several communities into a looser kind of union and failed in ways that cut. A few sites were later found and disturbed by parties we could not predict, and in those losses we felt the long, slow grief that lives in survivors. But we also saw children who had never seen another of their kind meet across a stream and circle each other with curious hands. We saw a woman trade a dried fish for a needle and walk away with a small, triumphant smile. Those things mattered a great deal. When we finally returned to the original shelter 5 years after we first set up our cameras, the valley felt both familiar and changed. The sounds were the same, but they carried new notes. Kura was grayer at the temples. Three's hands had new calluses shaped by the work of making security. Vince moved differently now, less brusque, more careful about the effect his presence might have. He had become, in a way, the keeper of restraint. We brought back with us more scraps, more carved tokens, more folded maps. The metal box of film we kept had grown into a strange, sacred archive. It contained reels and stills that could demolish ignorance or deliver prey. The choice of what to do with them was still ours. For a long time we decided on repository rather than release. We reached out only once, many months later, to a person we trusted, a retired anthropologist known to me by the merest of links. We brought a select set of low-resolution prints, heavily redacted, and asked simply for advice on how to protect cultures against exploitation. That person, to their credit, told us to keep quiet and to find legal counsel who understood land protections. It was the kind of help that moves like molasses but at least flows. The cameras remained the device around which our decision pivoted. They had recorded the tenderness that made the shelter a family. Kura's thumb smoothing a child's hair, Three's delicate line work, the way the community repaired a cracked wooden bowl. And they had recorded evidence of a history of aggression. The black and white photos of men with guns, the cave panels of rotors and traps, the ledger notations with X's by harbor names. Those frames were not sensational. They were testimonies. I will not attempt to claim a moral high ground. We made decisions then that were pragmatic and painful. We moved people, we buried evidence, we used the films as a bartered currency of trust rather than a spectacle. The choice to withhold certain frames, particularly those that showed domestic details or precise landscape, was the clearest moral posture we could manage, to treat the existence of a people as something to be preserved rather than paraded. And yet, even as guardians, we felt the constant pressure of external curiosity. There are always people who will look at a frame of grainy film and think of profit rather than protection. We knew that as surely as we knew the weight of a 17-inch print in fresh mud. That knowledge pressed on us the philosophy we had begun with. Better to hold the truth with solemn care than to let it be wielded by the indifferent. Now, years on, the reals and negatives are still wrapped in oilcloth and stored in places designed to be hard, not just to find, but to exploit. We have begun conversations, slow, guarded conversations, with legal counsel and a handful of scholars who promised confidentiality, and whose reputation suggested restraint. The goal, when we speak of it privately, is not to make spectacle out of life, but to secure protections that might prevent further incursions, land easements, conservation designations, legal recognition that would make collection and capture criminally fraught. These are political and legal projects. They move with the heavy feet of bureaucracy and with the lighter hands of people whose work is to prevent harm. What the cameras caught in that valley, what they recorded while we slept and kept vigil, were not monsters or curiosities for someone else's shelf. They were domestic lives, archives of memory, and the marks of persecution. There are reels that show the way Cora hums when teaching a child to measure the width of a woven mat. There are stills of three painting a sequence of small houses with smoke coming from chimneys, a simple portrait of community. And there are frames of blunt evidence, clippings with hunters written across them, cave panels with sequences of men and machines. Those images are painful and tender in the same grain. In the years since, we have made one further decision. If any footage is to be shown publicly, it must be done with the consent of those it depicts and in a way that does not reveal locations or vulnerabilities. That consent process is not simple. It involves conversations in low light, careful translation of the implications of public exposure, and above all, a recognition that some truths cannot be translated into public spectacle without cost. There is a legal and moral apparatus we are trying to build to manage that, and we are taking our time. I tell this story now. Why I tell it, you may ask. Because there are frames that exist which should both shame and instruct. They show the domesticity of beings the world had expected to demonize. They show catalogs of wrongs done to them. They show, in grainy black and white and in shaky Super 8, a choice made by a handful of men to become guardians rather than the heralds of a hunt. There are images I will never allow into the light without the slow approval of the people in them. There are images I have kept under oilcloth that might, one day, play a part in legal protections that preserve a life rather than turn it into product. There will be no easy press conference, no viral reel, only patient, stubborn work to secure safety. If there is a single last truth to be drawn here, it is this. Cameras do not simply reveal, they decide. The lenses we trained on those shelters did not merely record, they imposed a way of seeing, a way that required us to decide what kind of watchers we would be. Would we be exploiters or guardians? Would we hand images to men who would look at a face and see only a prize? Or would we hold the frames like small lives and choose secrecy when that secrecy was the better love? We set cameras deep in Bigfoot territory because we were looking for footprints and because my grandfather's notebook had insisted on keeping this knowledge from prying eyes. What the footage captured did not present a spectacle. It presented an argument. It argued that these beings were neighbors with histories and damage, and that those who loved them owed them protection rather than publicity. I cannot show you the full reels. I cannot in good conscience release the frames that would make a map of lives to men who would chase them. What I can say is this. There exists, in locked tins and in memory, footage that shows the most intimate moments of a people who have been, for generations, more observed than understood. Those images were never meant to be seen by a world that mistook curiosity for entitlement. If you want to follow this work, if you want to be part of a careful, ethical effort to preserve lives rather than exploit them, subscribe to follow. We intend to move slowly, to share only what can be shared without harm, and to create a pathway for those images to serve protection rather than predation. There are frames that must be seen by the right eyes for the right reasons, and we are still deciding who those eyes will be. We set cameras deep in Bigfoot territory. What the footage recorded changed us. It also asks of anyone who sees the story now, one simple test. Will you protect what you learn, or will you make it prey? The images exist. They show people with songs and scars, with tools and trophies of memory, and with a map that points to others like them. They show more than proof. They show trust, fragile and heavy. And so I keep the film in oilcloth, the prints under stone, and the memory of Kura's hand on my cheek. What is on those reels was never meant for casual eyes. It was meant as a covenant, as a witness. We carry that witness like a burden and like a benediction. If you stay with us, we will, in time and with restraint, share what must be shared to protect these lives, never as spectacle, always as stewardship.